Big buffs with the updates to the 10.2 PTR. Demonology Warlock is seeing a whopping 150% increase to its tier set damage. Augmentation nerf is gutted even more, at the very least in raid. And Havoc Demon Hunter swapping a lot of talents all around, with a lot of increases in damage and performance to the other specs. Is your main okay for 10.2? It's a little bit dramatic, it's probably gonna be fine, but let's see exactly what these buffs are about, and we are going to start with the aforementioned Warlock, specifically Demonology, even though Destruction got a little buffs here and there. But the main thing is that Demonology has had a resurgence with the latest changes to the talents that we had a week ago, specifically with Caustic Presence that made Vile Fiend just do AoE damage, and you can read the dev notes in the article link down below if you wish, but essentially that has been reduced because it was actually doing the most amount of damage in single target as well, and that's not really okay, I suppose, for an AoE talent. I can agree with that, but Vile Fiend Caustic Presence has been reduced by 50%. Now, Eye of Gul'dan benefits from haste and critical strike. Now, I don't know why that's a thing, but hey, Pit Lord also benefits from haste and critical strike chance. This could be giga good, because not to mention the Pit Lord's Fellseeker attack has also been increased by 30%. Now, in terms of the overall testing that people have been doing with Demonology in the raid so far on PTR, not a lot of people, or any for that matter, played Nether Portal and the Pit Lord, probably because of its super bad tuning. However, after these changes, I won't be surprised to figure out if Nether Portal is once again the go-to for single target, at least in terms of raids, specifically with Pit Lord, of course. And getting to the meat of the potato, Doombrand now deals reduced damage beyond 8 targets. So it's kind of soft cap at 8 targets, which I suppose, you know, it kind of keeps it in line with everything else AoE in World of Warcraft. But the more important part is that Doombrand's damage has been increased by 150%. That is, well, that's a big damage. However, there are mixed feelings about this, specifically from my point of view, because I've been looking at some of the Doombrand performance. Some people get some really big numbers out of Doombrand. You can see it right here on this particular log, which is 150% increase is going to be pretty good, while other times is a little bit too low. Now, obviously, the damage in either of these cases is too low for a tier set, so they're going to up that, of course, to kind of keep it in line. 150% sounds like a big number, but for something that was doing a little bit of damage, it might not be enough. It could be enough. It depends. It depends, obviously, on the person playing it right. Now, Doom Fiend's Doom Bolt volley damage has been increased by 150% as well, which, of course, goes into this also, because obviously Doombrand does its own damage, but when you have that chance to spawn the Doom Fiend or Doom Guard, whatever you want to call it, that ends up doing quite a bit more damage, and that's also being buffed by 150%, which again, that's going to be really, really good. And probably the biggest change, even though numbers, Immutable Hatred has been redesigned. Now, when you consume a demonic core, your primary Felguard carves your target, dealing physical damage. This sounds, first of all, like a cool concept, but we don't really know what this means. There's no number behind it. There's no buffing an ability that the Felguard was already using. Felguard is already, I think in most cases, the #1 source of your damage in single target period before this was introduced. So now I would imagine that what this does, it adds an extra attack to the Felguard whenever you use your demonic core, which is actually a really cool mechanic, because using demonic cores has to impact your playstyle in some way, and obviously gives you shards, but impacting your pet is also a really cool thing that Demonology can do. Now we're gonna quickly glance past Warrior with a couple of damage increases here and there. We're gonna keep seeing these nerfs and buffs to classes by a couple of percentages just to keep things in line, and that's pretty expected. Elemental has received a nerf to its 4 set, where now only your next 2 lava burst casts strike extra targets instead of 3, since Elemental was probably cranking a little bit too much, and Resto has had his chain light healing increased by 20%. However, more changes come to Rogue, and we're gonna start with Assassination. First of all, Exsanguinate is going to be renamed Sanguine Blades, which I guess, sure, it just kind of keeps people out of the loop because the names keep changing, but I do understand that this is not the original Exsanguinate ability, and if they ever want to bring it back, a name issue will probably occur at the time, so Sanguine Blades is probably the right thing to do for the Exsanguinate passive. Now we're gonna see a lot of buffs across the board, and Venom damage is increased by 8%, Kingsbane damage reduced by 5%, which, I mean, we've played with Whisper in some of the PTR testing that we did, and Kingsbane was destroying things. Now 5% might be a little bit too much. I guess we'll have to see, but overall it's just tuning in the end of the day. Indiscriminate carnage has also been made so that secondary targets now prioritize enemies that are not afflicted by growth and rupture. If you've tested assassination in M+ in any capacity, you might appreciate this change. And of course, similar to demonology, the tier set has been capped in terms of its AoE, where now it's soft cap at 5 targets, both the 2 set and the 4 set. And well, you know, I'm not a fan of AoE capping. I guess it is what it is, but yeah, Assassination was struggling in AoE to begin with. Hopefully this doesn't put it too low. Outlaw seeing a lot of changes as well, with triple threat chance to trigger increased to 15% up from 10%. Count the odds chance to trigger was reduced to 8%, well, from the prior 10%, but it can now also be triggered by Sinister Strike, which that's pretty much keeping in core theme with what Outlaw is doing. Hidden opportunity effectiveness of chance to strike twice reduced to 80% down from 100%. Listen, we're no strangers to what Outlaw was doing on the PTR, so seeing nerfs is not necessarily surprising. There's some issues being fixed, and also refreshing duration of roll the bones combat enchantments, enhancements, and now matches other enhancements as well. Subtlety is also getting buffs. Shadow Strike damage is increased by 7%, while Perforated Veins effect now applies after striking with your backstab 4 times instead of 5 times, so a buff here as well. The Rotten, the capstone, now causes your next 2 attacks that generate combo points, was only 1, after activating Symbols of Death to deal 35% increased damage, which was prior 50%. This is kind of like a small buff and a little bit of a mechanical change where you're, you know, applying the essential buff on the next 2 attacks. Each individual attack deals less damage, but together they do more damage than what the Rotten was doing prior with the 50% total bonus damage. Replicating Shadow's secondary targets now prioritize enemies that are not afflicted by Rupture. Once again, more smart targeting, more things to make essentially Rogue's life better. Now, a lot of changes have happened to Shadow as well. Considering that Shadow was dominating the execute phases of bosses, you're probably not going to be surprised to see some nerfs here, but now there are also some buffs. First of all, Surge of Insanity now triggers from every 2 casts of Devouring Plague and not 3, and Mind Spike Insanity now generates 8 Insanity up from 6. Mind Flay now generates 16 over its duration, which was 12 before, and we're getting to the tier set now, which is, okay, hold on. The 2-piece bonus additional Shadow Ward deaths from the set bonus are now triggered at 20% effectiveness, which was 35 before, which I guess it makes sense, and that's probably why the rest of the kit is being buffed, because they probably want to take away some of the damage from the execute phase. Another 2 set change where additional Shadow Ward deaths from the set bonus now deal reduced inescapable torment damage, and for the 4 set now it increases the initial damage of Shadow Ward Pain by 200% per stack, was 250%, and also an actual buff to Shadow Crush's initial damage that was increased by 100% per stack, prior was 50% as well, so probably more AoE agency. Overall, the Shadow Priest changes seem to kind of make sense. Now we're gonna have to see how they perform once they release the new testing phase for the raid, because right now they are essentially the kings in execute damage, and that's not necessarily a bad thing, but usually that's reserved for other roles. And it's not only that, it's the execute damage was way too high. Granted, the overall kit was fairly balanced. If you look at what overall Shadow is doing across a raid fight, its damage is okay. It's not blowing anybody out of the park. It's just skewed way too much towards execute. And I can understand that. Having a strong execute phase, that's cool. But outside of that, you're probably hitting like a wet noodle. And that's not fun for anybody involved. A couple of changes to Monk as well. First of all, the Brewmaster 4 set has its bonus stagger value absorb capped at 100% of maximum health. And we're going to see a similar change to Bear as well. And Mistweaver is now getting Rising Sun Kick granted by default when you're going to the class talent tree. The location of Healing Elixir and Zen Pulse have swapped. The starter build, of course, has been updated. These are just the first couple of changes to Mistweaver, hopefully making the class a little bit more appealing to new people as well, considering that you're just getting a baseline big damage dealing ability off the bat without having to actually put a point in it. Mage has had a lot of fixes. Hunter has gotten slight buffs. First of all, Beast Mastery has had the bonus piss that you call from Call of the Wild now spawn on top of your target rather than by your side. This sounds very basic, but in actuality, this is a big buff to their damage, because whenever you spawn Call of the Wild pets, they start at your location and they travel at relatively normal speeds towards the boss before they actually start doing damage. damage. That travel time, although it's flavorful, it's just wasted time not actually damaging the target. Now, one thing they could have done is just to increase their duration so that they compensate for the travel time, but instead they made it so that it just spawn at your target, which probably is a little bit better because it's more initial feedback on the ability's proc chance when the damage starts rolling out instead of having to wait for it to get there in time. And survival has probably gotten a bigger buff than it might seem. The empowerment buff from Coordinated Assault now lasts 5 seconds, which was prior to this 3 seconds. The thing with Coordinated Assault when you play survival is that it buffs either your bombs or your kill shots. Normally, you want to use them on kill shots. The problem with this is that most of the time you're capping bomb charges and you end up spending that buff on your bombs because there's just not enough time to wait to get the kill shot out. Now, in 10.2, the bombs are essentially more empowered by Fury of the Eagle. You might want to use the Coordinated Assault on the bombs, so kind of mix and matching these windows was a little bit janky. Hopefully, the increased duration of the buff so you can kind of time it right with the right ability gives you more flexibility and freedom to actually buff the ability that you want. However, this remains to be seen if we're going to be playing Coordinated Assault on survival to begin with, period, in 10.2. Now, Augmentation has been getting more and more nerfs with each patch. Now, this particular patch note really hits the raid effectiveness of Augmentation since they don't really impact Mythic Plus that much. So first of all, what they made, the overall arcing conclusion of the Augmentation nerfs is that they don't want stacking Augmentation to be an overpowered thing. This has seen multiple nerfs where now, if 2 Ebon Mites are already active on an ally, Ebon Mite will now seek a nearby ally with fewer than 2 Ebon Mites. Ebon Mite's priority to apply to other Augmentation Evokers has been reduced and will apply to other damage dealing roles first. This is mostly a quality of life, but of course in this scenario, especially in raids, you probably won't be able to stack more than 2 Ebon Mites on the same target. Similar, if 2 Prescients are already active on an ally, then Prescients will no longer be applied to that ally, period. This essentially kills any, let's say, Augmentation stacking in raid. Sure, you might be doing pretty well with more than one because obviously you have more than just 4 allies in your raid that you could essentially use Augmentations above them, but you cannot have those ridiculous memes where you just have, I think Biceps did this with like 1 or 2 other Unholy DKs in a raid full of Augmentation where it just did, what, 1 million DPS on a boss? That is kind of fun, let me be honest, that is kind of fun, but when it comes to raid progression, stacking Augmentation could be a little bit of a chore considering how much damage they give, and it might have ended up forcing raid leaders to make players actually play Augmentation for the ultimate progression damage. Similar to these other two, Shifting Sands now prefers to apply to an ally who does not already have Shifting Sands, which is great, and the Foresight has been addressed as well, where the Trembling Earth now allows buff stacks to overlap. And we have some death notes. With Prescience having 2 charges, there is now a case where you can lose a stack of Trembling Earth since you cast Prescience twice in a row. To alleviate that, the stacks may now overlap so you don't waste part of the bonus, essentially in how the tier set works with the baseline ability. Well, it's not really baseline, you have to talent into it, but it might as well be baseline because you're not going to play without it in 10.2. And last but not least, we have Demon Hunter changes, with probably the most amount of changes being addressed. And they are spicy, let me tell you. First of all, the overall conclusion is that many talents have changed locations and available connections, which, at least for Havoc, this makes building the capstones slightly better. I do agree. There's a new talent now called Champion of the Glaive, where Throwglaive has 2 charges and a 10-yard increased range. I think this is a choice node with Master of the Glaive so far on the PTR. I don't know if it's going to remain that way, but probably the biggest change is that Father to the Flame and Unleashed Power have been removed. Father to the Flame was basically one of the biggest changes to Demon Hunter's period, where it baked its effect into Spectral Sight. I think the last iteration that we had, that we covered in our Vengeance rework video, was the best version of it. Now it has been completely removed, and I don't necessarily know how I feel about it. I didn't particularly like it that it was a choice node with Collective Anguish. I still felt that it should be in the game. It's a cool mechanic. It's one of the very few Covenant abilities from Shadowlands that actually still retain some value and flavor into modern WoW. Now, because Unleashed Power has been removed, Chaos Nova has also had its cooldown reduced to 45 seconds down from a minute, and the Fury cost reduced to 25 down from 30. Unleashed Power, I think it was the one that made Chaos Nova cost no Fury, so I don't know if this is necessarily great. However, at least in terms of Havoc, but also in Vengeance, you generate a massive amount of Fury, so having more stuff to spend Fury on is maybe not necessarily a bad thing, but then again, it does condition the ability to require resource to use. Precise sigils no longer increases sigil duration by 2 seconds, and live by the glaive heal value has been increased to 4% of max health, up from 2%, which again we've covered in the Vengeance rework. It was a neat concept, but it wasn't doing enough. Now going into the actual Havoc changes, Soul Rend has been renamed to Soul Scar. Initiative critical strike chance bonus has been nerfed to 10%, it was 12% before. This has been a pretty much core aspect of Havoc ever since Dragonflight has been released. This is a really cool mechanic to play with, and it was so powerful that you would be using it in all builds. Now this is probably trying to keep it in line with everything else. Fell Barrage now has a maximum duration of 8 seconds. Prior to this was uncapped, probably to reduce the need to extend it, although, as we covered also in the Havoc rework video, extending it was very unlikely to be done. So maybe they just want to drive in the nail in the coffin or whatever, so to kind of really tell players that probably don't watch YouTube videos or guides online that they don't have to extend it as much as possible. It just lasts for 8 seconds. Now the Fury cost per volley has been reduced to 8, which was prior 15. This is actually pretty cool because it just drains the Fury a little bit slower. You can probably definitely guarantee the 8-second duration now, and the damage per volley has been reduced overall to probably tune the ability down. Now Fell Barrage is particularly, or at least was particularly janky to use with the prior iteration of it, because it was just like blasting through your Fury really quick. The fact that it lasts a long time, I don't know if I'm necessarily a fan of it. I kind of wished it would deal more damage and it lasted less, because I don't want this to be something that I have to maintain. Once again, Breath of Sintragosa was mostly disliked by the majority of the player base of Frost Decay, and this is kind of what this felt like, an ability that drains your resource and you have to work to maintain it. Now you can only cap it at 8 seconds, but at that point, why not just make it no longer extendable, just make it do a flat amount of damage, consume a flat amount of Fury. Well, listen, it is what it is. Now, the 2 set bonus has been redesigned, which is probably the more interesting thing. Now, Blade Dance consumes a charge of Throw Glaive to fire at your primary target for 100% damage, and each slash has a 50% chance to throw a glaive on an enemy for 35% damage. Now, this needs very extensive testing, because one thing, if you don't have any charges, does that mean that the 2 set does not work? Which probably means that you're probably never going to want to press Throw Glaive period, so that you can just cast it passively with all the damage amps that you can get through the talent tree. This is actually pretty neat if it maintains all of the buffs that Throw Glaive gets. Now, I'm not sure if you need to have Fury to spend on Throw Glaive if Blade Dance launches one as well, and each slash has a 50% chance to throw another glaive. Now, this second effect of the tier set, does this also include a charge? Because it is not stated, and I would imagine it won't be, because you have a lot of slashes in Blade Dance and you don't have that many Throw Glaive charges. So I would imagine the second part of this is not going to consume a charge. And the 4 set has also been updated with Throw Glaive reduces the remaining cooldown of the hunt by 2 seconds, and the hunt's damage over time effect lasts 6 seconds longer, making essentially the hunt a bigger part of your essential rotation and playstyle. Vengeance has also received a bunch of changes. Again, talents have been moved around the talent tree and new connections have been made, which is great, because that was probably the biggest weakness that the Demon Hunter talent tree had. And we're seeing a bunch of damage. Shear, Fracture have been increased by 10% in terms of their damage dealt, Soul Cleave by 7%, Throw Glaive damage increased by 30%. Now, I don't know why Throw Glaive damage has had its damage increase for Vengeance. They don't really have Throw Glaive synergies here. Sure, it's a good way to pick aggro or pick mobs apart, and maybe the extra damage can contribute to some of the threat that you can do as a tank. That's kind of the main value I see out of this. Maybe there's something that I'm missing. Calcified Spikes now provides its benefit if Demon Spikes is refreshed in addition to when it expires. This is actually a fantastic change, because of the way that Calcified Spikes worked before is you wanted your Demon Spikes to drop so that this buff can proc, and then you can just go into your next window of Demon Spikes. That's not always ideal, particularly if you're in, I would imagine, in a high octane AoE Mythic Plus scenario where you cannot afford your Demon Spikes to drop whatsoever. And not to mention that now, since you can keep let's say 100% uptime for however much you're in combat of Demon Spikes, you're getting the actual buff as well, making you even more tankier. It still retains the thing of, well, I only really get the full value of my defensives once my Demon Spikes expire, not when I actually need them. So that's still a little bit janky, I mean. So we'll see how that ends up playing out. Now, Demon Spikes can no longer be cancelled manually. Probably once again to solve the issue of people forcibly cancelling their Demon Spikes, because the calcified spikes was just way more damage reduction than the actual demon spikes. Meteoric strikes now reduces the cooldown of Infernal Strike by 10 seconds, which was prior to this 8. That's just great, it just means more leaps. Fell Flame Fortification now reduces magic damage taken with Immolation Aura active by 12%. Prior to this was 10%. Vengeance is even better at taking magic damage, which is great. Feast of Souls healing value is increased by 100% and no longer has an initial tick. Yay, I suppose. That's great. Just means more survivability. Bulk extraction cooldown has been reduced to 1 minute, which was prior to this a 1.5 minutes. And soul barrier value has also been increased by 28%. These have been severely underused or practically dead talents throughout Dragonflight, so seeing buffs to these is really reassuring. Are they good enough to be used? We'll have to see, but at least they are stronger. Fiery Demise now increases your fire damage dealt to enemies afflicted by Fiery Brand by 25% for the first point and 50% for the second, up from 20 and 40% respectively from before. Obviously more fire damage, that's really great considering that the tier set that we have now gives you even more fire damage with Sigil of Flames. And lastly, Focus Cleave now increases soul cleave damage to primary target by 50%, up from 40%. Overall damage for Vengeance has been taken up to the next level. This is particularly great. I still want to see a little bit more tankiness being added. I'm not particularly convinced because the calcified spikes, for instance, makes it so that you can no longer proc your actual strong DR buff on command because you cannot cancel demon spikes anymore, but you have to wait for it, which is not ideal for tanks whenever they struggle with survivability, but we'll see how that ends up performing in the overall patch. These have been pretty cool changes that we cannot wait to test on the 10.2 PTR, and to kind of put it in line into perspective, you should definitely check our Vengeance Demon Hunter rework video that covers all of the changes so that you can understand all of these buffs and nerfs that are happening right now.